Felisberto Hernández. 1. An author with more advocates than detractors. Felisberto Hernández was an author who inspired as much despise as applauses. Since the first stages of his writing, he received opposed opinions from critics and writers. He received positive and negative reviews regarding to its literature value, criticism that include indifference, rejection, and despise, but in the same way, approval, recognition, and a very deep admiration. By Fernando Chelle. Carlos Maggi, the great Uruguayan writer from the generation of 45, said once, Felisberto was the main enemy of his literature. He was an insecure guy, shy, like a cornered man. He was desperate for gaining confidence, seeking to be praised or given a favorable opinion. D.I. Candia, 2003. It would be good to analyze these words and ponder, from a historical perspective, on why Felisberto was eagerly seeking the approval of his contemporaries. The Felisbertian narrative was a significant break with what had been done so far on in Uruguay. Although Uruguay already had outstanding storytellers within its tradition, such as those of the 900s generation, Javier de Viana with his literature about the countryside and Horacio Quiroga with his stories in urban environments, there was no writer by that moment whose narrative perspective was so associated with the psychological and mental associations, rather than the rational and structured one. The case of Felisberto is different. His texts have nothing to do with a testimonial realism. His attention to aspects such as the memory, the mystery in everyday life, the relation to the body, the animation of objects, among others, make him an author with an avant-garde look within Uruguayan literature. Usually, when an author breaks in the artistic field and breaks what is traditionally accepted by critics, the same critics look at him indifferently, marginalize and relegate him. It was kind of what happened to the work of Felisberto Hernández. A certain part of the contemporary critic to the author did not hesitate to attack him. The Uruguayan critic Alberto Zumfelde, at first, was very hostile to the work of the writer. He did not name him until the third edition of his book Proceso Intelectual de Uruguay, Intellectual Process of Uruguay. He studied Felisberto from a psychoanalytic point of view of his characters, of whom he says, "The predominance of sexual complexes is a permanent characteristic in the morbid psychology of his characters, whom the author engages in the fantasy of their circumstances. Almost all of his characters experience libido-related psychosis." Zumfelde, 1967. But no doubt, it was Emir Rodriguez Monegal who criticized Felisberto the most, and also analyzed him from a psychoanalytic perspective. That child did not grow up anymore. He did not grow up for his life or for his mind. He did not grow up for the art or for sex. He did not grow up for speech. It is true that he is precocious and can touch with his words, after his eye saw or his hand touched, the instant form of things. Someone will claim that this is poetry. But he cannot organize his experiences or communicate them. He cannot regulate the fluency of his words. All his immaturity, his absurd precocity, is manifested in that inexhaustible chatter, crossed, sometimes, by some happy expression, but always imprecise, always loose, always overwhelmed with vulgarities, pleonasms, inaccuracies. Rodriguez Monegal, 1948, pp 51-52. Perhaps the use of the first person in the vast majority of the Felisbertian stories, and the fact that he narrates the events that happen to a traveling pianist, caused that a certain part of the critic would not separate, when analyzing it, the reality of a person, the author, and the reality of a fictional character. The author is analyzed as if he were the character, but this is not correct, regardless of whether there are clear similarities between Felisberto and the character of his stories. The artwork belongs to a fictional level, is autonomous and should not analyze a fictional character as if it was the author, because they are different entities. But while it is true that throughout his life Felisberto received a certain disdain on the part of the critic, also it is certain that he received great compliments and shows of approval to his work. In 1922, writer, playwright and Felisberto's school teacher José Pedro Bellán introduced him to the Uruguayan philosopher Carlos Vaz Ferreira, who influenced and positively approved his work. The famous and humble first four Felisberto Hernández's books, known as Los Libros sin Tapa, Fulano de Tal, 1925, Libro sin Tapas, Book Without Covers, 1929, La Cara de Ana, The Face of Anna, 1930, and La Envenenada, The Poisoned, 1931, managed to have a positive opinion not only from the philosopher, but also from other writers and intellectuals of his time. Between the people who approved, we can find Antonio Soto, Carlos Mastronardi, Mercedes Pinto, and Esther de Cossés among others. Regarding the influence of Vaz Ferreira, Nora Giraldi de Icas said, "From the philosophical point of view, all of Hernandez's work can be assimilated to some of the fundamental pillars of the so-called philosophy of life, in which the thought of Vaz Ferreira is inscribed." Giraldi de Icas, 1975. On July 31, 1935, a tribute was paid to Felisberto in the 8 Neo-Cultural Institute in Montevideo, where the writer Esther de Cossés, the artist Joaquin Torres Garcia, and the literary critic Alberto Zumfelde talked about Felisberto's work. The support of Joaquin Torres Garcia to the work of Felisberto was also seen in the year 1942 on the occasion of the publication of Felisberto's book, titled Por los tiempos de Clemente Colling, by the Times of Clemente Colling. This fundamental book was the winner of the Premio Ministerio de Instrucción Pública, Ministry of Public Instruction Prize, which was sponsored by 13 personalities among whom Garcia was. The following words can be read at the beginning of the book. A group of Felisberto Hernández's friends edit this novel, in recognition of the vast work done by Wright for this country, and his quality as a composer, concertist, and writer. Hernández, 1942. The friends referred are Carmelo de Arzadam, Carlos Benvenuto, Alfredo Cossés, Spencer Diaz, Luis E. Gil Salguero, Sadi Mesa, José Palladino, Julio Palladino, Yamandu Rodriguez, Clemente Ruggia, Ignacio Soria Gauland, Nicolas Tedesca, and Joaquin Torres Garcia. Around that time, the Uruguayan French poet Jules Supervielle wrote a consecration letter. Felisberto added this letter in the final pages of his book appeared in 1943 El Caballo Perdido, The Lost Horse. In that letter, Supervielle makes a reference to the impact that caused on him having read by the Times of Clemente Colling. The letter goes, "I have had so much pleasure on reading you, on getting to know a really innovative writer who reaches beauty and greatness just by being humble in the matters of writing. You reach originality without looking for it, just for a natural inclination to intellectual depths. You have an innate sensitivity towards stories that someday will become classics. Your images are always meaningful and fulfill the need of getting engraved in the spirit. Your narrative contains pages worthy of being featured in rigorous anthologies. They are absolutely admirable, and I congratulate you with all my heart for having given us that book. Thanks also to your friends who have had the honor of editing those pages. Yours, Julio Supervielle, Hernández, 1943. In addition to supporting, recognizing and spreading Felisberto's work among intellectuals and writers of the time, Supervielle became very important in the life of the Uruguayan storyteller. As Councillor Minister in charge of cultural affairs in the Uruguayan embassy in Paris, in 1946 Felisberto obtains a scholarship granted to him by the French government. The stay of Felisberto in France lasted for 2 years. The positive reviews and the praise to the work of Felisberto Hernández happened throughout his life and increased notably after his death. Just a few days after Felisberto's death, on January 17, 1964, Angel Rama, a critic who was always a great defender of Felisberto's work, wrote an article titled, On Felisberto Hernández, a Gracious Poet of Matter, where he says, one of Uruguay's greatest storytellers, the most original, authentic, and talented one, has died. He also unloaded several criticism against the intellectual environment of the time, which in words of Roberto Ibáñez, would only recognize the literary work of Felisberto within 20 years after his death. Rama said in the mentioned article, to put it this way, in a controversial tone, or like Ibáñez, referring to a possible future recognition, is the same than taking a look to the inertia of this country to perceive art when this art is not born in the agitated and frivolous world of those who believe to own the culture, when it is born outside the conventional society that they have established for literature, without anyone knowing the origin of this authority or knowledge. Rama, 1964. The international recognition from the critics and the readers to the work of Felisberto Hernández came before the time stipulated by Roberto Ibáñez. The year 1974 is very important because his complete works were edited and compiled by José Pedro Diaz. This work had its final edition of 3 volumes in 1983. On March 31, 1974, in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentinian writer and journalist Tomás Eloy Martínez wrote an extensive article in La Opinion's cultural supplement titled, "Nobody Should Forget Felisberto Hernández," where he told details of the writer's final stage of his life, and then continued with a complete biography that approached both the Felisberto's personality and some features of his work. Also, in 1974, Nessuno accendeva la lampade, the Italian translation of Nadie incendia las lamparas, Nobody Would Lit the Lamps, was edited by the publishing house Einaudi, from which Italo Calvino highlighted the originality of the Uruguayan storyteller. Felisberto Hernández is a writer who looks like no other. He does not look like any of the European nor any of the Latin American writers. He is an irregular who escapes all classification and all framing. Calvino also states, the author has come to conquer a place among the specialists of the Hispanic-American fantastic story, Calvino, 1974. In 1981, the Ayacucho Library published an edition titled Felisberto Hernández, Novellas and Stories, in which came a famous letter by Julio Cortázar. In this letter, Argentinian writer expressed his deep admiration and affection for Felisberto Hernández, telling how he was dazzled by tales like El Acomodador, The Usher, and Menno's Julia, except for Julia, and expresses, "I wonder if many of those who ignored or forgave your life then, and still, were not unable to understand why you wrote what you wrote and especially why you wrote it like that." Cortázar, 1981. He described Felisberto as the Eleatic of his time for not accepting the logical categories imposed by the tradition, and also said that all the wonders and darkness of the world are present in La Casa Inundada, the flooded house. There are many and very different writers who both in life and after the death of Felisberto supported his work. There are many more advocates than those referred before, such as the Argentinian poet Oliverio Girondo, who helped Felisberto to publish Nobody Lit the Lamps in the city of Buenos Aires in 1947, Juan Carlos Onetti, Augusto Roa Bustos, Carlos Fuentes, who considered him, along with Juan Carlos Onetti and Horacio Quiroga, an initiator of the new Latin American literature. We could also add the names of other artists who commented positively the Felisbertian work. According to Walter Rieler, Felisberto had comments on letters that he proudly showed, coming from Amado Alonso, Gomez de la Serna, Mauli, Puccinai, Mastronardi, Rieler, 2002. In 2002, a tribute was paid to Felisberto Hernández at the Autonomous University of Mexico, on commemoration of the centenary of his birth. It began with a telegram from the Colombian Nobel Prize winner Gabriel García Márquez in which he recognized that if he had not read Felisberto, he would never have become the writer that he was.